This is Basic, the Atari ST podcast.
SpeedScript was written in a couple of months by our 18-year-old untrained programmer. You've got a whole staff of professional programmers, and frankly, if you can't do better than him, then you don't deserve to be in business. It was a full-page ad for I think it was a strip poker program. He got a complaint letter, Robert did, from a school principal at an elementary school somewhere in the U.S., saying, we've got this magazine in our school library. We can't have strip poker in there. This is unacceptable.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Tom R. Halfhill was features editor of Compute magazine and was later launch editor of several other magazines from that publisher, including Compute's Gazette, Compute's Atari ST, and Compute's PC magazine. He co-wrote the book Advanced Amiga Basic and was later editor of Game Players magazine. This interview took place on March 29, 2016.
Basically, I was a journalism major in college, and this was in the mid-1970s. We didn't have really any computers then. This was before really any personal computers were available, except for a few kit-built machines that I wasn't aware of. Mm-hmm. So to me, the ultimate writing tool in those days was an IBM Selectric typewriter. And when I got out of college, I was saving my money to buy one. And then one day I walked into a Radio Shack and saw a computer, TRS 80 Model 1, and it turned out that you could run a word processing program on it. And the same year, my newspaper had installed terminals, VDTs, we called them then, video display terminals, to do word processing, very primitive. So that was my first exposure to computers. And when I saw the machine in Radio Shack, I thought, I could own my own word processor. But I didn't know anything about them, so I had to learn about computing from scratch. I had no background in college at all. Mm-hmm. So I actually enrolled in a community college course, just Intro to Data Processing, which had nothing to do with personal computers, but it was all about mainframes, but it got me started in learning about computers, including programming. So that's how I got started. And then I bought after doing a lot of research, reading computer magazines and taking more classes at the community college, I ended up buying my first personal computer, which was an Atari 800. And I got that in the fall of 1981 with my tax refund.
Nice. So any particular reason you chose the 800?
Yeah, well, after doing a lot of research, because remember, they were expensive then. Mm. We're talking just for the machine, roughly $1,000, not even counting a disk drive or printer or software or anything, which would be, by inflation, that'd be about $3,000 in today's money. So putting the whole system together would be $4,000 or $5,000 in today's money. So I did a lot of research, and it was, overall, the Atari 800 was, I thought, the most advanced of the personal computers at the time. It could do the word processing I wanted, but it also had a color display, unlike, say, the Commodore PET, and it had more sophisticated sound and graphics than the Apple II. And it just seemed like the best, most advanced all-around machine as far as graphics and sound and text display. Back in those days, the Apple II couldn't even display lowercase text. It was all uppercase.
Right.
Because that was before the Apple IIc and the E came out. So if I wanted to do word processing, naturally I wanted upper and lowercase. Same thing with the TRS 80 Model 1. I don't think it could do lowercase either. So it was a combination of factors that led me to the Atari.
So once you had it, was word processing primarily how you used it?
Yeah, that's why I got started with it, was word processing. I got an early word processing package, and it took me, actually it was about 6 months before I could afford to buy a floppy disk drive, which was $500. That'd be about $1,500 in today's money, and it was only a 5.25-inch floppy drive that could store, I believe, 88 kilobytes on a disk, which was $5 per floppy. So everything, you tend to forget how expensive everything was then compared to today. But yeah, I started with word processing, but it also came with a beginner's manual on programming in BASIC. And I'd already done some basic language programming in these community college courses I took. So I started reading this book and got interested in it. I never really thought of myself as being a programmer, but I realized it wasn't that hard. So I started writing basic programs, and that kind of got me rolling on doing things with the computer other than just running packaged software.
Nice. So how did you end up at Compute Magazine? I see that you did some work at some Cleveland-based newspapers and magazines, and then how did you end up at Compute?
Right. Well, like I say, I was a journalism major in college, so I got out as a newspaper reporter, my first job. I was working as a newspaper reporter in Ohio, and then I got a job at Cleveland Magazine, writing just general kind of like features and so forth. And that's when I got interested in the computers and bought the Atari. And I got so interested in it, one of my colleagues says, maybe you ought to consider writing like for one of these computer magazines you're always reading. And I thought about it, and that kind of made sense. I thought about I'd be getting in on the ground floor of something different. And also that last winter in Cleveland was a really bitter winter. I got frostbite on one of my toes one night when my car wouldn't start in the middle of the night. Yeah. So I was kind of looking, maybe I could get out of Cleveland and move to some warmer climate. Although I did interview at one of Wayne Green's computer magazines up in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which would have been going from the frying pan to the fire, or whatever the frigid version of that is.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, I ended up taking a job at Compute Magazine, which was located in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Right.
And that was great because it got me into a warm climate. And my sister had already moved to North Carolina, and my parents were planning to retire there. And it was a good magazine. I looked at all the early computer magazines, and I liked Compute, and everything was rapidly changing and expanding in those days. So I had sent some resumes out, and I got a reply back from Compute, and they flew me down to Greensboro for an interview one day, and it looked pretty good. And so when I came back home, they offered me a job as book editor, but I was kind of disappointed. I didn't really want to be a book editor. I'd never really edited any books, and it didn't seem as interesting. I wanted to cover the news that was happening. Mm-hmm. So I kind of turned down that job offer. And I thought, well, that's a shame. I liked them so much. And then like a week later, they call back and say, okay, we're going to make a job for you, features editor of the magazine. Will you take that? I said, sure.
Nice.
So that was that. And I was down there, I think I started in May of 1982 at Compute Magazine. And that was a real exciting time. All kind of stuff was happening then.
Nice. So tell me, okay, so you get there, your first day, your features editor, here's your desk. What were you doing? Were you in charge? I'll leave it there. What were you doing?
Well, it was a new position they created for me. They didn't really have a features editor before, so I reported to the managing editor, and my job was to write feature articles and news coverage on what was happening with personal computers. So right off the bat, like within a few weeks, they sent me to 2 computer shows. One was called the National Computing Conference, which doesn't exist anymore. It was in Houston, Texas. And then they sent me to the Consumer Electronics Show, which was, in those days, there was 2 Consumer Electronics shows. That's CES, which still exists today, but now it's only once a year. Every January in Las Vegas. Back then it was twice a year. January in Las Vegas and June somewhere else, Chicago, I believe. Mm-hmm. So I went to 2 of those shows right off the bat within a few weeks of being hired, and my job was to cover everything happening at the shows and come back and write it up. And there was a lot happening then. In fact, that first trip to CES, I think that's when the Commodore 64 was coming out. And there was just tons of new computers. I remember one CES I went to, there was over 30 new computers shown, all by different companies. It was just a mass. Everybody was jumping into the business in those days. And, of course, 99% of them failed, as we know, but it was just so much to cover. So I was doing that. They flew me up to Pennsylvania to take an early look at the Commodore 64 before it hit the stores. I spent a day at Commodore. They showed me how the machine worked and gave me some programming manuals and everything. That was an exciting trip.
What'd you think? When you saw you're one of the first people to see it, What did you think?
It was a good computer. It had it really caught them up with the Atari 800, which I had before they had the VIC-20, but it had only a 22-character screen. Only 22 columns across the screen. It was very kind of big and ugly, but it was a good computer for the price. It was $299 when it came out, which was like a miracle for a color computer in those days. But the Commodore 64 I thought was a big breakthrough, especially the sound. It had a sound synthesizer chip, and it was way ahead of everybody else. And it had 64K of memory in it right from the start, all soldered in. So it was a good machine. So in fact, we liked it so much we started a separate magazine just to cover the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20. But that was an exciting machine back in those days, and turned out to be what some people say was the best-selling personal computer of all time, the Commodore 64.
Right. Since I'm going to jump to this since you mentioned it. I know that you were involved with the Computes Gazette for the Commodore 64, and then later there was the Computes Atari ST magazine, and there was Computes PC Junior magazine, which I think you were involved with. Was a Compute Atari 8-bit specific magazine considered?
Well, Compute always was 8-bit specific from the beginning.
Sure, but I mean it was 8-bit specific, and it was multi-platform,
right?
Which I loved. I mean, you could read about the TI, you could read about the Atari and Compute, but then it had the Computes Gazette for the 64 only. And I'm just wondering if you remember if anyone ever thought of, well, why don't we have a Atari specific magazine for the
an Atari specific magazine.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. We talked about a lot of different things. Compute, actually, now that I think about it, Compute wasn't 8-bit specific because we covered the TI 99-4A, which was a 16-bit machine. Mm-hmm. But Compute, you're right, was the general, what we called a horizontal magazine that covered all the platforms. What happened was, when the Commodore 64 came out, we saw it was going to be very popular, and we thought it needed its own magazine because so many people were buying it. It could support its own magazine. And I was actually the launch editor on that magazine, and also on the other ones you mentioned, like the Atari ST magazine and the PC Junior magazine. So I was the editor who had to launch all those magazines, and it was just that we identified markets that we thought could support its own magazine would be popular.
Sure.
We could split those off because in Compute you only could have, maybe even when it got really thick, maybe 3 or 4 articles per platform at the most. So, and there were other platform-specific magazines coming out. So we thought we had to compete with them by having our own platform-specific magazines in addition to Compute. So it was just a way of reaching more readers and, of course, obviously attracting more advertisers and getting more coverage out there because we were actually being swamped with articles. We had people sending us articles, and we didn't have room to publish them all in Compute. It was kind of frustrating because we had lots of good articles we couldn't get out there, and some of them were going to the competitors. So that's why we launched all those platform-specific magazines.
Neat. Nice. Yeah, so tell me about the submissions. What was the quality ratio of like, oh, this is great to, wow, this is terrible? How much crap did you get, I guess is the question.
Well, we got a lot of crap, yeah. One thing to keep in mind about these magazines is different maybe from a lot of other national magazines that exist is that most of the articles were contributed by readers. We had some staff-generated content, obviously, but most of the programs came from the readers, the program articles, the type-in programs. And the quality was all over the map. So what we had was meetings where we'd sit down, take all the submissions that came in that week, go through them, run the programs, evaluate them, and we'd sort them into piles. One pile we'd reject out of hand, just not worth anything to us. Other ones we would accept, but we realized we're going to have to do some work on this program because we had in-house staff programmers. Mm-hmm. And then there was a third pile which was like, oh, these are really good. We can publish this pretty much as is. So we sort of ended up with like 3 bins like that. And we ended up taking a lot of stuff that some of it never got published and some of it needed more work than we ended up having time to devote to. But we called this collection of stuff the pool. It was like a pool of articles we could draw on for issues of the magazine we had to put out. So it was common for somebody to say, oh, we need another article this month. Oh, go to the pool and pull one out for Atari or Commodore or whatever. And then we also had this, another term we used, which sounds kind of strange. We had what we called homogs. And a homog was a port of a program to another platform. So let's say somebody submitted a game for the Commodore 64, and we liked the game, so we'd have our in-house programmers write the homogs. In other words, port it to Atari, or port it to TI, or port it to Apple, or whatever. So we called those ports homogs, and it came from the word homogenize. We were like homogenizing it to run across all these different computers.
Right.
So our in-house programmers actually got very accomplished at doing this. They could take a program that came in and crank out a homog in just a matter of days, and sometimes it'd be better than the original.
Nice. And sometimes the quality showed, but
yeah.
Right. Nice. Well, cool.
So it was, we had some really talented in-house programmers, in particular, like, say, Charles Brannon, and in addition to writing homogs, they would do original works. So Charles was famous for his word processor that he did.
Right.
Yeah.
SpeedScript.
And he had, and he had a couple of other, that was SpeedScript. And that took, he first showed me a prototype of that. Believe it or not, that was written in a programming language called Forth. With, I don't know if you remember that or not, it was Forth, which ended up being used for scientific applications, but not much else. It was an unusual language. But he showed, when I first started at Computer, he showed me a prototype written in Forth, and nobody had Forth, so we really couldn't publish it. And then later he ended up rewriting it in machine language for the Atari. And then we did homogs for Commodore 64 and VIC-20 and Apple II and I think PC, everything. But that was a real big hit. And do
you have a sense of how widespread use of that program went?
It was very widespread. In fact, it became so widespread that one of our advertisers complained that we were ruining their business.
Really?
Yeah. This is so long ago, I guess I could talk about it now, but there was a company that made a word processor, and I think it was called Quick Brown Fox.
Okay.
And it comes from that phrase, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog or something, which uses all the keys in the alphabet.
Yeah.
And frankly, it wasn't a very good processor. I think it was for the Commodore machines. And when SpeedScript came out, it was obviously superior. And Quick Brown Fox was a major advertiser in our magazine. They had full-page ads running, pretty often. And they came into our offices one day to meet with us, and they complained that we were ruining their business because we were publishing this word processor. And they were just like scolding us. I was in this meeting, we were in this conference room, and they were scolding us, for ruining their business and everything. And I was kind of like, I'm not, especially back in those days, not the most diplomatic of people. And so after sitting here getting scolded for about 10 minutes, listening to them ranting on, they finally stopped. And then I said, SpeedScript was written in a couple of months by our 18-year-old untrained programmer, self-taught programmer. And I said, you've got a whole staff of professional programmers, and frankly, if you can't do better than him, then you don't deserve to be in business.
Wow.
And that's almost a direct quote of what I told them, as far as I can remember. And they're like shocked. They weren't expecting anything like that. I guess they were expecting us to come groveling and apologize or something. And they were just like leaning back in their chairs and couldn't believe it. So the meeting didn't end very well. But they did end up going out of business. But it was the truth. I mean, we had a better word processor than they did, and they had no excuse for not having a better one. So our philosophy was, we're just going to publish the programs, and if the commercial companies can't keep up, that's their fault. In most cases, the commercial software was still better, but we had a few hits that did make them look bad sometimes.
And you wrote some software too, especially for the Atari. I've been looking around and I found a game called Nessie, and just here and there a few little basic programs that you created. Do you have any stories about that?
Yeah, well, Nessie came about. That was a game because a lot of the games back then and today are violent shoot-'em-ups where you go around shooting people and stuff. And a friend of mine from Cleveland, in fact, said, why doesn't somebody write games for kids that aren't violent? So that got me to thinking, and I thought, so I'll write a shoot-'em-up that's not a shoot-'em-up. You're not shooting with a gun, you're shooting with a camera. I'm an amateur photographer anyway. I'm interested in that. So I wrote this game where instead of shooting the creatures, you have a frame on the screen that's the camera viewfinder, and you try to catch a clear picture of the Loch Ness Monster. That was my idea.
Nice.
So I was always fascinated with the Loch Ness Monster anyway, and these blurry pictures that would show up now and then, most of which were hoaxes, or all of which were hoaxes, I guess. But so I wrote the game, and I had a machine language routine that animated the viewfinder so it moved pretty fast and smooth on the screen. Charles Brannon helped me a lot with it. And then later he wrote a homog, a port for the Commodore 64, and it was actually better than my Atari version. Yeah, that was what inspired that. I wanted to write a non-violent video game for kids or anybody really. Nice. And Charles helped me a lot on that. Charles Brannon he's one of these people that thinks in code like the rest of us think in English. To me, I can program, but to me, I'm always like translating into a foreign language, so to speak. And he seems like he can just think in computer language. So I would have these bugs. One time I had this bug in my program, and it was a machine language routine. I think it was for Nessie. And every time I'd call the routine, nothing would happen. And I couldn't figure out why. And after a couple of days, I came to Charles with it and showed him my code. And he starts looking at it, like 30 seconds he starts laughing. And and he found it that fast. And it was something stupid where back in those days, if you wrote a machine language routine, for a basic program, you'd have to poke it into memory. You'd have like a loop, a program loop, and you'd poke the bytes into memory, and you'd call the subroutine. Well, when I wrote this loop to poke the machine language routine into memory, I forgot to increment the variable in the loop. So it poked the whole program into one memory location, right? Uh-huh. So the only instruction that was left in memory was the last instruction of my routine, which was a return
RTS,
from subroutine.
Right.
So as soon as it was called, it would bounce right back, and nothing would happen. So Charles was like, just increment this variable, and your program will work. And I did, and that was it. But he spotted something in 30 seconds that took me like 2 days I couldn't figure out. And I only saw Charles stumped once like that. It was soon after I first came to compute, and he had a game that wouldn't work. It was for the VIC-20, and it was some animation game, and the character kept jumping randomly around the screen, and he couldn't figure out why. And he worked on it for like days and days, and was just like tearing his hair out. So he couldn't solve it. He was the best programmer in the company, so nobody else could help him really. So finally, he got frustrated, and he called up Bill Wilkinson, and he was one of our columnists, and he actually wrote the Atari operating system and the Atari Basic interpreter. It was in the Atari 800. Yeah. And this game was for the Atari, and Charles described on the phone what was going on, and Bill Wilkinson figured it out. And what it was, Charles was using this machine language routine that ran, I think, in the vertical blank interrupt or something. And not to get too technical, but the bottom line is the 6502 processor in the Atari had a decimal mode, which is pretty strange for a processor in those days. Everything was, you wouldn't think of binary, but it actually had a decimal mode. And there was some operating system routine that was going to decimal mode, and he was interrupting it without going back to binary mode.
Oh.
So when he was doing his animation calculations, it was being done in decimal instead of binary, and he didn't know that. So Bill said, just put this one instruction in your machine language code. It's CLD, clear decimal. In other words, get out of decimal mode. He put that CLD in, and then everything worked perfectly. And he was like, oh, my God, days of work, and it all comes down into this. So it became a shop rule at Compute Magazine. Whenever anybody wrote a machine language routine for the Atari, the very first instruction had to be CLD. Didn't matter. And people would come in and say, well, why? Just don't ask any questions. Just CLD has to be your first instruction.
Nice. That's awesome. Do you remember any other programs that you wrote that had? I mean, let's say I'm trying to find the list here. You did some stuff that ended up being published in a couple of the type-in books, and looking at the list here, but it doesn't call out specifically programs. So.
Yeah, I did write a program called Tank Duel, which was kind of like a shoot 'em up. It just had like a map on the screen with a town with some houses and some trees around and everything, and you had these two tanks on the screen. And actually how that came about was I wanted to make a spaceship shoot 'em up game, but I couldn't get the spaceships moving fast enough. They were like crawling across the screen. So I thought, okay, I'll make them tanks. Tanks move slow, right?
Right.
So that's how Spaceship Duel became Tank Duel. But sometimes you have to do what you can to make the thing work. But that's how it worked, and it was just basically just two tanks. It was a two-person game with two joysticks. So you'd play that, and the only thing I thought really clever I added to that game was I had landmines, and these were like invisible locations on the screen, and if you just ran your tank over it, your tank would just blow up. I thought that was kind of cool. And the game would plant 3 landmines on every screen randomly. Each time you started the game, it would change the location randomly. But so that was kind of a fun game. And strangely enough, just a couple of years ago, I got an email from somebody in Italy who found this game and needed help getting it working on his Atari emulator on his PC. And I'm like, really? I wrote this game 30-some years ago, and you're running it on an emulator now, but stuff never dies, I guess. Code never dies.
How long are you expected to provide technical support?
Yeah, exactly. But I did help him. I gave him some information, I guess, and I might have sent him the source code. I can't remember if I still had it around or not, but however it worked, I helped him out, and he was satisfied. So,
nice.
But yeah, I wrote that game, and I wrote a machine language game. One game I wrote completely in machine language. It was called Cutoff, and it was for the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20. It was a 2-person game, and it was kind of like inspired by some arcade game where you move this object around the screen and it leaves a trail behind you, and you have to not run into the other person's trail. Mm-hmm. So I did that all in machine language. That was the only game I wrote completely in machine language.
Wow. Nice. And you did plenty of other writing other than programming, and some of it was Atari related. For instance, I found you have an article called Atari's new top-of-the-line home computer, where you kind of give the first look at the Atari 1200 XL. And I was kind of wondering how did stuff like that come about? Would Atari send you the thing, or did you have to go to some office to see it? How much hands-on did you get for things like this?
Well, usually there'd be a trade show. You'd go to a trade show, and they'd have it there, like a CES, for example, or Comdex, and they'd have a booth, and you'd see the new stuff they brought out. But then sometimes they would call us up, too, and we'd go to their office. So it was different things, and, of course, there was not the Internet like we have today, so news traveled a lot more slowly. And a monthly magazine could keep up with things like that, even though we had a 2 or 3 month lead time. But the Atari 1200 XL, that was a good machine. In fact, I ended up buying one from my dad later on. Had a really nice keyboard.
Yeah, it's still considered the best of the Atari keyboards.
Yeah, that was a nice machine. Things got kind of strange later on when Atari and Commodore kind of traded places, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Some people left Atari, went to Commodore, or went to Amiga, which was then acquired by Commodore, and then Jack Tramiel, who owned Commodore, ended up buying Atari, and that was sort of strange.
Right, yeah. Were there times when you felt pressure to maybe be more positive about a product than you wanted to be, either from the company or from higher-ups or anybody?
No, Compute was pretty good in that respect. The founder of the company and editor-in-chief of the whole operation was Robert Locke, and he was very much a believer in journalistic integrity. And he put that down to the whole staff. So we weren't pressured in that way from our own management. And if companies tried to put pressure on us, they really didn't get very far.
Yeah.
And Robert also was, he was very adamant that the magazine had to be a family magazine. And this caused some conflicts for us at some point. Very early on when I came to Compute, it was like within the first few months, we ran this advertisement. It was a full-page ad for I think it was an Atari program, because Atari had the best graphics then. It was for I think it was a strip poker program.
I was going to guess the strip poker, or probably Artworks strip poker.
Yeah, and of course, we're talking 8-bit graphics, so, it wasn't what you would call today X-rated, but still, it was a strip poker game. And he got a complaint letter, Robert did, from a school principal at an elementary school somewhere in the U.S., saying, we've got this magazine in our school library. We can't have strip poker in there. This is unacceptable. And Robert agreed with the guy. He wrote back and said, yeah, you're right, we shouldn't have taken this ad. So that was it. We took no more ads for that strip poker game.
Wow.
And this came up a few times subsequently. I remember we had spent, our salespeople had worked for years to get CompuServe to advertise in Compute magazine, and they weren't doing it for some reason. So finally, after a couple of years of work, they got CompuServe to place a full-page ad, but then when the ad copy came in, it was for some online like adventure game, and it was all about, I can't remember, it was like Vikings or something like that, and the ad was illustrated with this picture of like this like big Viking guy, and he's got this woman in his grasp, some scantily clad woman, and the headline on the ad said, "To the victor go the spoils." And, it was like, loot, pillage, and rape kind of thing or something.
Right.
And Robert looked at that ad and said, "Nope, we can't run this in Compute." And the salespeople just like hit the ceiling. We spent 2 years trying to get CompuServe to advertise in Compute. And Robert says, "No, we're not going to run this ad." And that was it. And CompuServe was pissed off.
Yeah.
But he just wouldn't do it. So after that, after that school principal complained, he took a hard line on the advertising and tried to make sure it was a family magazine. We rejected a lot of games and things for that reason too. Occasionally somebody would submit like a strip poker game or something else like that, and we just wouldn't take things like that.
Do you have any particularly memorable things that were submitted that you had to say no to?
I can't remember. I just can't remember offhand any specifics on that. But occasionally we have to reject something just for some ethical reason or something like that.
Right.
Sometimes it would be such an exact copy, too, of a copyrighted game, we were kind of nervous about it.
Some of the magazines had problems with, they wouldn't accept ads for programs to defeat copy protection, hardware and software to do that. Was that one of the issues that came up at Compute?
Yeah, I don't think we had any programs meant to defeat copy protection. It was kind of a gray area then, and a lot of those things didn't work that well anyway.
Right.
I can't recall us publishing anything like that. We didn't have a lot of ethical issues to deal with, but occasionally we did. And I was glad I worked at Compute because I was a journalism major, remember, one of the few at the company. So, I was schooled, and we even had an ethics course when I was in school. But Robert took a hard line. He didn't have a journalism background, but he did believe in journalistic integrity. So we didn't really have any problems like that, and we didn't get too much pressure from advertisers. If they did, they were kind of turned away, and they kind of realized we weren't easily pressured in that way. Another thing we did was we wouldn't run. Some advertisers would ask us to run like their ad for a game next to a review of a game if they knew we were going to review a game, and we wouldn't do that. Robert would always try to put the ad not next to the product that we were writing about, whereas other magazines would do that on purpose.
Right.
But he thought it looked bad, even though we didn't take the ad as payment for the article. It just looked bad. He just didn't want to do that.
Nice. So okay, so you how long were you there? I don't know when you left Compute.
Compute. I was there from like 1982 to I think 1988. I think
That's
it
a
was
good
like
long stretch.
About 6 years, yeah.
And were you basically in the same position the whole time?
No, different positions. Like I say, I started as features editor, and then what happened was Robert asked me to launch the Compute's Gazette magazine. So I was editor of that, and that was successful. So then I became like the default launch editor. So then when we launched the Atari ST magazine, I was the launch editor of that, and also the IBM PC Junior magazine, which didn't succeed. So I was launching several magazines like that, and then what happened was about a year after I'd came to Compute, Robert had sold the company to ABC. So we were part of ABC Publishing. And they kept Robert in charge, but he had less authority than he had before, a little bit less, and he was kind of getting antsy. So he decided to start a new company. So he left in 1988 and started another company called Signal Research, and then later hired me away to go join him, as well as some other Compute people. He hired away to go join him. So that's how I ended up leaving Compute. I was still working for Robert.
Mm-hmm. And that was there you were working on Game Players magazine? Is that right?
Yeah, that's when we launched Game Players. The original plan was to launch a technology newsletter, which we eventually did, but it didn't really take off. And then we launched a Nintendo magazine. It was meant to be just like a one-shot magazine, something you put on a newsstand. It's just one issue, and that's it, a special issue kind of thing. But it sold like hotcakes. So we decided, okay, let's forget about this technology newsletter and do these video game magazines instead. So that's how Game Players came about. It was just, when you're running a startup, you have to be flexible.
Right.
And the original idea, if it doesn't work, you have to try something else. So that's how we ended up doing that. And we ended up with several game magazines.
And you also wrote a book about Amiga Basic. Yeah,
that was when I was still at Compute. We had a book division, and Charles Brandon and I collaborated on that book. And it was called Advanced Amiga Basic. And that was the first book I wrote, and it was a lot of work. I was working, because I couldn't do this on my work time. This was considered separate from my job. So I was working nights and weekends on that, and I think it took like 6 or 8 months or something to write that book. It was a lot of work. Yeah. So Charles and I shared the duties on that. I did most of the writing and some of the programming, and he did most of the programming and some of the writing. We kind of divided it up that way because he was the better programmer, although he's also a very good writer. But the book was very successful, especially considering it was, an esoteric subject for a computer which was popular but not super popular.
Right.
So I think we ended up selling something like 25,000 copies, which
it's not too bad.
For a subject like that on that platform, that was considered very good. Mm-hmm. But it was a lot of work. And one thing I learned, I wrote, I think I co-wrote 1 or 2 books after that, but then I quit because I learned the problem with writing books is it's a lot of work, and you don't know at the time how much you're getting paid for your work. You don't know if you're getting paid 5 cents an hour or 50 cents an hour or $5 an hour or $50 an hour. Right. You don't find out for like 2 years, because it takes you a long time to write the book, then it has to go through an editing and publishing process, and then when it comes out, it has to sell for a couple of quarters before the royalty checks start coming in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a long lag time between starting the book and getting money back, and then you don't know until the book is basically stopped selling how much money you finally made.
Right.
Then you can figure out, okay, how many hours I put in, how much did I really make on this project.
I was a freelance technology writer for more than a decade, and I wrote some books, and I wrote a lot of magazine articles, and I found I just didn't have the patience for books. It was just thinking about one subject for that long was too much for me. I would rather bang out 2,000 words, move on to the next interesting thing, and that was better for my short attention span.
Yeah, well, that's the conclusion I came to, and I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
It's not, unless you really have a big bestseller, it's not all that rewarding. And like I say, I'd rather just bang out articles when I know, okay, it's going to take me a couple of weeks to write this article. I know how much I'm going to get paid in advance.
Right.
I get the money a couple months later, and it's all done. I go on to the next thing.
Right.
So
tell me something about the work environment of compute. Was everyone nose to the grindstone, or was it a party atmosphere, or how was it?
It was both. I mean, we worked hard, but it was also kind of a party atmosphere in the sense we were all about the same age. All of us were like in our 20s, and for many of us, it was our first or second job or something, and it was a very new industry with lots of new stuff happening. We felt like we were in a new industry, so we had a lot of fun, and there was a lot of excitement. And because we were kind of like all in the same age group, roughly, all at the same stage of life, we all had kind of common interests. So we had a lot of parties, and we also did in the summer camping trips and whitewater rafting trips. Every summer, a bunch of us would drive up to the mountains, the Smoky Mountains or Blue Ridge Mountains up in western North Carolina, and we go on these whitewater rafting trips or whitewater canoeing or kayaking on like the Nantahala River, some of those rivers up there in the mountains, and we have a lot of fun. Although some people took some spills and wouldn't go again, but so we had a lot of fun that way. We had camping trips and rafting trips and parties and things, and it was a good time. I mean, it was kind of like in a way, it was kind of like working for a company, but also it's kind of like a fraternity in a way. Mm-hmm. And I had a lot of close friends that I still keeping track of all these years later.
Nice.
And it was a good time. I look back on that time of my life, and I really enjoyed it.
Nice. And what do you do today?
Well, today I'm what they call a technology analyst. I write about microprocessors. That's my specialty. And I work for a small analyst firm, and we publish 3 technology newsletters, mostly for engineers, and we sponsor 4 conferences a year in Silicon Valley, and we publish these big reports, which are like books, basically. And we also do private consulting work. So it's a lot of different stuff, but those are our 4 lines of business that we do. And it's a strange departure from my beginnings as a newspaper reporter. I tell people, microprocessors, writing about them pays better than writing about murder, and the hours are more regular. But it's basically, I still basically consider myself a journalist. They call me an analyst now, which is a fancy name for a journalist, but I'm just more specialized. Mm-hmm. And I work in Silicon Valley, and I'm still keeping up with the latest things that happen in processors and so forth.
Nice. Is it more exciting now or then?
It was more exciting then. Yeah, it was more exciting then because the industry was much smaller then. Now it's a huge behemoth, and all the mainstream publications cover it. Back then, it was like you're in on this secret that most people didn't know about yet. Because most people didn't have computers yet. It was just starting to come out, and the whole concept of a home computer seemed strange then. So it was like, you're in this almost like this subculture is what it was back then, a very geeky kind of subculture, and that's kind of gone away. Now it's like all mainstream, and now it's big business. It's a whole different experience now.
Yeah. What haven't I asked you about your time at Compute that I should have?
Well, there's so many wonderful people I worked with there. I've mentioned Charles Brannon, who was our most talented programmer, and we had good editors. Richard Mansfield, I think you've already talked to him, and Robert Locke, who was the boss of the outfit. He founded a company with a shoestring that, turned out to be very successful. He might be hard to talk to. He's a very private person. But the people I work with there, we had many good feature writers that we ended up hiring. We had Selby Bateman. he might be someone you want to talk to at some point.
Okay.
Kathy Yackel and just a lot of good friends I still keep track with. Now with Facebook, of course, we can keep track. And one thing that kind of pulls us together, I have my annual Oscar contest. It's a contest just for my friends and acquaintances. And I started it back in Compute days. The one I just had here last month was my 33rd annual. It's for the Academy Awards. And how it started was we'd all get together at my house on Oscar night, and I had these paper ballots, and you'd mark who you think was going to win in every category, like Best Actor, Best Picture, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the show, we'd pass these out to everybody, and we'd add up all the points manually and decided who won. And we put money in a pool, and you'd win some money. And it kind of got out of hand, so I thought maybe I should write a program to automate this. So I wrote this program called Oscar Calc, and it was a play on VisiCalc, which was the leading word spreadsheet program in those days.
Sure, yeah.
So Oscar Calc was my scorekeeping program, and I wrote the first version. It was a DOS program written in Microsoft Quick Basic for PC. And I used that for a number of years, and then in 1998, I completely rewrote it in Java and added new features and things. And that Java version I wrote in 98 is still running today on all versions of Windows and Mac and Linux. It runs on anything, without modification. And I added features to it over the years, so now it also predicts who's going to win. It creates 3 computer-generated contestants that often do very good. They're always near the top. It's a contest we do once a year, and it kind of draws a lot of my old friends together. We have it's an online contest now. So Oscar Calc, as the show goes on TV, every time an award is announced, I type in who won, and then my program automatically generates a list of all the contestants, sorts them out by score, generates automatically an HTML file, and posts it up on my personal website so people can follow the contest as they go along and see who's winning. Nice. And my goal is to have the updated scoreboard posted on my website by the time the winner gets to the podium and starts making the acceptance speech. So that's kind of fun.
Neat.
Yeah, and a lot of old compute people take part in that. In fact, Denny Atkin, I think he won the Booby Prize this year for last place.
Nice.
Yeah. So, and we're even on second generation. We have a niece of the founder of the company who won the contest a couple of years ago.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Cool. If you could send a message to the people who read Compute back in the day and are listening to this now, what would you tell them?
Well, I guess I'd say thanks for reading Compute. Thanks for keeping us going all those years, and thanks for the great stuff you sent us, all the programs and articles that we needed to keep the magazine going. And I'd say that the people who read Compute in those days were at the forefront of this whole computer revolution. I mean, these were the people who got in early, and I still hear today from people who say, I got started typing in programs for my VIC-20 or my Atari or my Apple, from your magazine. Yeah. And these are people today who are running companies in Silicon Valley. They're top engineers and so forth. I hear this so many times. That's how they got their start. And it was just a great time to be involved in something that was brand new, and this doesn't come along very often. So, thanks for all the fun.
Perfect. I think I have what I need, Tom. Thank you very much.
Great. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.